welcome to the Friday, September 4th, 2020 edition of the Clemson Dubcast. 8 days away as we record this early on Friday afternoon. I don't even need to tell you what we're 8 days away from. Everybody knows that. Paul Strelo and I just put the finishing touches on our annual TigerIllustrated.com season forecast. That's coming Sunday. Hope I'm not giving too much away just by telling you when it's going to run. Always one of our most important and most read features of the season at TigerIllustrated.com. And then it's on to, finally, game week. Looking forward to it. Title sponsor of the Dubcast since the very beginning, back in August of 2018, Parham Smith & Archenhold Law Firm in downtown Greenville. They want you to know that their office remains open and available to serve you during the COVID-19 crisis. They are also offering their clients the ability to meet via telephone or through video conferencing. Whether you have a loved one who has suffered from a car accident, defective product, a neglectful nursing home facility, or medical malpractice issue, Parham Smith & Archenhold's Greenville lawyers can provide the protection and guidance you need. Free consultations, 864-990-4581, or on the web at parhamlaw.com. That's P-A-R-H-A-M law.com. Football season is grilling season, and Jack Oliver's Pool, Spa, and Patio is South Carolina's premier source for the big three names in grills: Weber, Traeger, and my favorite, the Big Green Egg. Make the most of your stay-at-home tailgate party with a premium gas, charcoal, or pellet grill from Jack Oliver's. Their 10,000 square foot showroom offers a huge selection of grills, patio furniture, and hot tubs and saunas. Shop in the store or buy online at Jack Oliver's Pool, Spa, and Patio, 3303 Forest Drive in Columbia, and JackOliverPools.com. Okay, first up, newly minted scholarship long snapper for Clemson, Jack Maddox. Really cool story there. How does a kid from Boston end up at Clemson and end up long snapping? Then after Jack is distinguished historian Vernon Burton. We take a look back at the truly fascinating time of Harvey Gantt's acceptance into Clemson University as the school and the state of South Carolina went through integration. Awesome conversation there, but we're going to start with Jack Maddox. Here we go. All right, joined by Jack Maddox, the newly minted scholarship deep snapper for the Clemson Tigers. How you doing, buddy?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Was talking to your uncle, Paul Russell, Clemson landscape architecture professor, he claims. And he sounds like he was a mean uncle growing up. He said he threw you against a refrigerator once when you were 6 years old.
Yeah, so funny story about that, Larry, is that, Paul is a very mild-mannered person. I think anybody that comes into contact with him would agree. But, there's just sometimes that he might lose his cool and but not actually. But no, there's a funny story about a little incident when I was in kindergarten where I got in trouble. Sometimes I'd always take responsibility on myself, and I just happened to blame it on my uncle who was living with us at the time, and almost got him in some police trouble and almost got him arrested for I don't know the term, but child abuse. Yeah, child abuse. But luckily, he got all straightened away. But he could not have been a tenured professor if it wasn't for some adults coming into the situation. So basically, in kindergarten, you told him that your uncle had thrown you up against the refrigerator. Right. So I was I was a bigger kid when I was younger, and so my mom always told me, as most big kids growing up were told, keep your hands to yourself, and because you're bigger, and people look, if something goes wrong, they look at you. And so there was some instance where somebody stole something, and me just being a dumb kid threatened to punch somebody because I stole my lunchbox or something like that. And, this is a long story, but in short, I just watched Harry Potter, Sorcerer's Stone, where the last scene where the guy's hair was getting thrown around and everything. And the first thing that came to my mind after I got in trouble was to blame somebody else. So I thought of that scene, and I told him that my uncle threw me against the refrigerator. That's why I have all these anger problems.
So actually, the reason I'm interviewing you is not to talk about your scholarship, but I actually do some side work for the Massachusetts DSS, and they're just doing some fact-finding, information gathering on your uncle. But no, seriously, congrats on the scholarship. And well, first of all, can you just share sort of how it happened? I guess Dabo always has a really good sense of springing that on I guess unsuspecting walk-ons. So how did it happen?
Yeah. So I don't think he planned on how it happened. I don't know anything special planned, but anyways, I was walking to, like I said, we're still in camp. It was the last day of camp. And then we had the scrimmage, I think a situational scrimmage, and it was around midday before lunch. And I'm walking to what we call the castle, the Clemson Sports Applied Science Lab or whatever.
Where's that?
And that's where that is. It's in the facility.
Okay.
It's in the back corner.
Oh yeah. They opened that last year. That's right. Yeah.
Yep. And everybody has their own. Everybody on the team has their own kind of. I mean, especially in camp when you're there for 14 hours, everybody has their own kind of nap space. And mine is in one of the massage chairs in the back. So I was walking to that, and I noticed that Coach Swinney was walking behind me down the hallway, and you want to acknowledge him, but you don't want to have too much of a conversation with him because it is Coach Swinney. And he asked me where I was going. I was going to go take a quick nap in the castle, and he just kept walking behind me. I assume he was just going back to his office through his little back corridor. And then when I got into the castle, he asked me if I paid for school yet. I said, I believe so. And then he said, I'll have a little bit more cash in my pocket because he's going to put me on for this semester at least. So that was obviously a great feeling and definitely a surprise. And he later told the team when he brought everybody up after the situational scrimmage to inform them, but it wasn't when I first learned it wasn't a public ordeal.
And I guess Ben Batson giving up football is what freed up a scholarship.
It might have been. I think Ben gave up. Well, not gave up. I don't want to say that term. Decided to for health reasons to stop playing. I think it was a couple days after. So it might have been. I have no idea. Gotcha. It might have been like a Brighton Constantine, but I can't give you anything solid on that.
And what was it like when he announced it in front of the team?
Oh, I mean, in front of the team, obviously it was great. A lot of people have known me in this program for 3 years, and it's especially the guys that I came in with were especially happy for me. So it was a good feeling. Coaches, everybody in the program that I've gotten to know and truly appreciate. Give me a big congrats, and that everybody in the program knows how big of a deal it is, and we're not talking days and weeks, we're talking years of putting the work in and being dedicated and committed, and I was obviously happy to do it and follow my dream, but this is kind of the cherry on top.
Let's talk backstory here. So you grew up, you spent all your life in Massachusetts?
All my life in Massachusetts, yes. I grew up I went K through 12 at Acton, Massachusetts.
And then your mother, Mary Price Maddox, was a accomplished track athlete at North Carolina, right?
She was, yeah. So she had a similar story to mine, where she was a phenomenal high school athlete. She went to Chapel Hill. Didn't originally was kind of debating on. She was a walk-on originally, and she went through the first year of school and missed sports, and she was trying to decide if she wanted to try walking on at for girls basketball or doing track. And so I think she was better at it, had more of a passion for track. So she was a heptathlete for a little bit, and she doesn't tell a lot of people this, but she earned All-American status as a javelin thrower.
Wow!
So and she was like third or fourth in the nation at that, and because So she always tells stories. I mean, at North Carolina at that time, especially at track, she was a captain. She was a captain her senior year of people like forgetting her name, Marion Jones. was there. She was obviously there at the time when Mia Hamm was there. She told me stories about, hanging out, playing pickup basketball games with Mia Hamm, and just it was kind of obviously UNC has always been a dominant sports school, but in terms of kind of glory years, I feel like the early '90s, the time that she was there, my parents were there. It's kind of like Clemson right now in terms of athletic success across the board.
And then so she grew up in Nashville, but they ended up in Massachusetts because your father's residency was up there?
Yeah, he's doing his residency as a pediatrician.
Gotcha. And so, can you explain? Okay, you're a 3-sport athlete in high school. Acton Boxborough, am I getting that right? Regional high school.
Yeah, Acton Boxborough Regional High School.
Yeah, how far is that from Boston proper?
It's about 35 minutes northwest of Boston.
Okay,
so definitely suburbs.
And so, Clemson obviously an unconventional option for an aspiring, I guess, walk on. Can you take us through your options, your junior and senior year of high school, and sort of what you were weighing, and as far as what you were going to do?
Yeah, so throughout my growing up and being a huge college sports fan, I had it made up in my mind, and if I had the opportunity, any opportunity, I would want to go. I would want to go, go big or go home kind of thing. And obviously, there's numerous really good athletic programs up in Boston and New England, which a lot of people do. But I just, I grew up in a family where, we had family members that went to bigger schools. Some walked on, and like my mother, who's won 7 ACC titles. I had a different perspective than a lot of kids that just kind of know the New England schools. So I grew up, it was my dream just to play sports one way or another. For a while was doing the recruiting. I don't even know the recruiting cycle for trying to walk on to be a decathlete at numerous schools across the country. I took a UNC visit, got to visit UGA just through connections. But that was another way I was trying to just become a Division I athlete in capacity, because that was kind of always my dream. Then I acquired the fluke talent of long snapping, which I actually credit, my uncle of kind of teaching me some basics, but it was when I came to Swinney camp where I kind of really fine-tuned my craft and was able to kind of get better at it, and then later get noticed.
I'm sorry.
Then football-wise, for me is when I realized I had this. It was when I came to camp to just come to camp because I was coming to visit my uncle in Clemson, and then I got some love for this for long snapping, and I realized this could be a tool for me to be able to play for a Division I team. So I went to numerous camps and all that, but it was really the Clemson camp that I found I had the most success and most traction at.
Usually the better athletes on high school football teams are long snappers. So what did you just ultimately decide that, what caused you to take that on?
To take long snapping?
Yeah.
I played defensive end and tight end in high school, and I probably had the size and, the ability to possibly play, to play at smaller schools up north. But I just decided that if I wanted to make the commitment of being a college athlete, I'd like I said, I'd rather do it big, and what not bigger than do it at Clemson. That kind of my junior year, when I started kind of in contact with coaches and Coach Caldwell specifically, I really was kind of gung-ho about it and really wanted to proceed forward with it.
And so you did do some of that in high school?
I did. I snapped. So I long snapped, and I played both ways, which taught me how to snap when I'm tired.
So, Robbie Caldwell, you said, I guess that was the first sort of contact you had with the staff at Swinney's camp?
Yes, it was.
And so you referenced it as a sort of a fluke talent for long snap. And was it pretty instant where you discovered, hey, I might be better than most people are at this?
Yeah, I mean, I was good. I'm trying to phrase this. I knew I was a lot better than, you see a lot of high school games. You see snaps going all over the place. I knew I was pretty good at it through my freshman and sophomore year. But I never with kicking and punting and snapping as a specialist. It's so specialized, and people go to camps and work with private instructors all across the nation. And not that I never got into it. I didn't get into it early. What I had kind of going in was a little bit from an instruction from guys who are already in Clemson from camp, but really what got me to Clemson was just me working on it into a baseball net for 2 years.
At home?
At home.
For how long each day?
I would say probably, I'd probably do it for at least 2 hours a week. Mm-hmm. Just finding time, because obviously I play other sports, but I knew that if I could cultivate this could be a ticket to fulfilling a dream kind of thing.
Anybody who's been up to Boston knows that not a whole lot of interest in college football up there, even for the local team, Boston College.
Yeah.
What was your first taste of, like you said, going big and seeing what it's like down at Clemson in particular, and just in the Southeast in general? Yeah,
definitely. When I came down, so it was unfortunately, my unofficial visit to Clemson my senior year was the Pitt game, which I don't know if it was a good or bad sign. But when I first realized, I was like, I made it moment was when we played Auburn my redshirt year. Where it was like 6 o'clock night game. It was like 14-6. But when I looked, I know obviously I have big teammates, but when I looked across at like Auburn's offensive lineman, I was like, this ain't Massachusetts suburb football anymore. So that's when I kind of realized that was like kind of where I was.
Was Christian Wilkins like talked about up there at all? Because that's where he's from. Like when you're still in high school.
Yeah.
Was he a popular figure?
Yeah. So with Christian, it was Christian is from Springfield, but he went to I think Deerfield, which is a prep school down in Connecticut. So he was just outside especially the prep school. There's a big public versus private kind of esplanade that's kind of going on. So he was playing in Connecticut. So I'm sure people knew who he was. I had some conversations with him about, he originally was from Framingham, I believe, before he went up to Springfield. And Framingham's not but 30 minutes from Akron, so he knew where Akron was and all that. But like I said, you're right. Pro football trumps, the Patriots trump college football in New England. So it's just not the same environment, and so it's definitely not talked about nearly as much.
So your mother is she still teach history up there?
She does.
Okay, and first of all, has she missed a game? Does she follow you all over?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think. So yeah, I don't think she's missed a home game. Yeah, I don't think she's missed a home game. Since I've been at school, and I've played, I want to say total, which is actually not bad for having been a backup long snapper, probably about 27 snaps. When you think about it, like proportionally, it's pretty pathetic. And to come all the way down just to watch your son probably wave a towel. But my first 2 years, she would get done teaching at. She still does, but she'll get done teaching at probably about 3. She'll drive to Logan. Her flight leaves Logan at she'll get to the airport around 7. She'll probably get to Atlanta around 10:30. and she'll have a rental car for the weekend. She drives up to Clemson and gets here at 12:30 every week on the dot. People know her at every airport that she stops in because she does it so routinely, but she loves doing it because she just loves to be a part of it. So that's what she's done for a while. My dad comes to most games he can. Obviously, his schedule is different from a teacher standpoint.
Wow. And then on top of that, the expense. I mean, were you doing out-of-state tuition, I guess?
Yeah, out-of-state tuition for the past couple of years. So, I mean, yeah, it's obviously, I have great parents that we don't, it's about the experience. We'll pay for it later, but I think both of them realize the unique opportunity that I would get to be a part of. And, by realizing that, you really don't think about it. And like I said, thank God for Southwest too, with all the miles she's accumulated. So that's also helped. What's their reaction when you make that phone call telling them about the scholarship? Oh, I mean, obviously my mother was through the roof, really happy for me. She didn't pick up originally. So I called Paul's mother, my grandmother in Nashville. And obviously it was, everybody was ecstatic. My dad was super happy for me. I think he was in the middle of like seeing 2 patients or something like that, so he couldn't talk long, but obviously he was proud of me. I called him later that night, but it was great. I didn't tell many people, because, I just, I don't like to, I find myself a pretty humble guy for the most part, so I don't like to, broadcast it to the world. So I just kept it with a few people, and when Coach Swinney told the rest of the team, I just kind of let it pan out, the news pan out on its own.
Your Uncle Paul was a walk-on at Tennessee back in the day. Does he keep his raging jealousy inside about you getting the scholarship, or has he shown it? Has shown his anger over the last week or so to you?
Not specifically. I don't know if you've seen that photo on his wallet that he still keeps. I'm sure he snagged a picture, some random picture day for Tennessee football in the spring of '98. But I would correct that title of a walk-on to more of a crawl-on to Paul Russell. That's what we call it around here. So, obviously he's still got that picture, and we'll talk about, Peyton Manning days, but no, he's obviously proud of me, and I appreciate a lot of input, and it's great having him in Clemson as a resource.
Well, lucky for us, I don't think he listens to the podcast, so he'll never hear this anyway. But I got over the summer, talk with a few of the former specialists like Dawson Zimmerman, Mark Buckholtz. I don't know if you know those names from the distant past, but Zimmerman told me a story of when they were back in 2008. They're getting ready for the Gator Bowl in December, and it's really cold. And this sort of sums up the life of a specialist. Like, they get their work done, and they don't have anything to do, and so they go over behind the equipment shed, the old equipment shed that used to be over there by the moat, and they start a fire to keep themselves warm.
Oh, yeah, in practice.
Yes, during practice.
Okay.
That really sort of hits on the totally different existence of a specialist compared to the rest of the team, and I'm wondering what's your sort of view of that? Like, how it's sort of.
No, yeah, I can attest to that. I've heard some crazy stories over the years, and everything's changed with different groups of specialists and all that. There are different kind of cohorts of specialists that come in, and it's just different. It's kind of like generations, you could say. But I have heard some pretty wacky stories of specialists doing their own thing, and it is a unique relationship. Obviously, our job is it's more like golf. It's 90% mental. The other guys are out there, busting their butt and everything. And I think there's a mutual appreciation. Obviously, we got to get our job done, but there's a mutual appreciation that, everybody's got their own role. But I don't think we don't make fires. We don't hide in sheds. Luckily we have an indoor now. But we do entertain ourselves, and I think Coach Swinney knows that. But it's inevitable. We can't snap and kick for 2 hours, or else our legs would fall off. But as long as we get our job done, the coach usually leaves us alone during practice.
So when you first get here, Clemson's coming off the national championship, of course, but at that time, maybe some on the outside viewed it as kind of a bit of a flash in the pan, given that Deshaun Watson was here, and sort of the confluence of a lot of really super talented players that one school doesn't usually get a lot of over a course of years. But obviously now a much different sort of spin on Clemson being much more than that and kind of historically good. What does it mean to you to be around something like that is such a part of that's going to be such a part of history?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, before Paul, I mean, I'm not going to keep talking about Paul, but anyways, before I came, before I really applied to Clemson or looked at the college, college search process, I really didn't know much about it, specifically the football program. The history. I mean, it is, we are in rural South Carolina. It's just not, Clemson had won a national championship, but it hadn't gotten to that quite elite status yet, and now it is. So I just didn't know a lot about the history and the greats that have come before. But obviously Clemson football has had a lot of incredible things. They've had incredible players. But you don't know you're in the glory years till you leave them, kind of thing. And I don't think that where we're at now, and especially with Coach Swinney's leadership, I don't think it's going to be catching lightning in a bottle thing. I think we're gonna be here for a while. So just to be a part of some of the early, I'll just say the early glory days, hopefully, is definitely meaningful, and it'll be a lot of fun when someday I come back to tailgate and we'll get to boast about some of the teams I've been a part of. So I'm excited for that. Hopefully I can I got a couple more years to still be in it, but when that time comes, I won't shy away from boasting a little bit.
How has the extra year of eligibility affected your sort of long-term thinking?
Yeah, so I mean, I have this year. I'm a senior academically, a redshirt junior football-wise. So I have 2 more years, including this season. And obviously, I think the NCAA did with the extra year eligibility, I think it's a great thing. I think it's a great thing for a lot of guys that that might just need that year and may have to play 1 year and really just need the redshirt kind of thing. I play that by year. I plan on staying a 5th year. But you got to cross that bridge when you come to it. But I think a lot of guys are excited about that idea, and it's just you play it as you go.
How utterly weird has football in a pandemic been from mid-March, when you guys were basically done, until even now, when there's just so much uncertainty, and things sort of change by the day, just not just here but elsewhere, mostly elsewhere.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you're in the job and the tedious routine of college football, I mean, when we had that break in March, I thought it was going to be 2 weeks, and everybody was like, oh, 2 weeks, this is great. You know what I mean? They'll be back and whatever. We kind of catch your breath, let your body recover. And then when obviously it turned into what it was, it turned into, oh, crap, what's going to happen, kind of an appreciation. But, I mean, we always had the mindset anyways, preparation-wise, that, we're getting ready for, I don't know when we're supposed to play, August 29th. But in terms of kind of a deep breath in a weird way, I think the pandemic, obviously it's not appreciated, but at the same time, it was good physically and mentally, especially for a college football player, just to, kind of break from that tedious cycle of year in, year out. So from that, it was great. And then, I mean, when we all got back together, I mean, it was weird. I mean, obviously we're in masks. We're not. There's a new normal, but definitely the appreciation factor and the and just all being back together. I think it definitely allowed us to realize that what we're doing is unique and special.
Also, it seems like a lot of the entire team learned a lot of quick, hard lessons early on with the spikes, and just sort of how to behave when this stuff is around. And It seems like
Yeah.
it's gotten a lot better, of course, over the last month and a half or so.
No, I definitely think so. I think a lot of guys, and including myself, have gained a lot of knowledge on, what it's going to take to, pull this thing off. And I think we're in a good spot right now, and we're really looking forward to it. But from a football sense, there's only, there's a new normal, but at the same time, especially during camp, there's only one true way to prepare for football, and it's just the traditional way. You just can't. It's not like other sports when you could possibly kind of tweak some things, and with the pandemic and stuff. I mean, there's only one way to prepare for football, and that's just the way people have always done it. And despite all the new protocols and everything, there's no change to that. So I think a lot of guys find familiarity with 2.5 hour, 3 hour practices out in Jervy Meadows. You're just kind of like, well, it is football season. Everything's not quite changed. So yeah, it's been good.
At any point during this whole process, as you elevated to a starting role finally, and you're about to enjoy that element of college football, did it enter your mind, man, this might not happen? This could be taken away.
I mean, yeah, but yes. I mean, obviously, I mean, you hear all the media, and you're hearing different things every day, and you just never know. But I mean, I would credit Coach Swinney with keeping us positive mindset. You can only prepare for what you know and what you can control. And I think everybody on the team has adopted that mindset, and it's I think it's going to really help us be successful this fall. And coming, obviously I've just depth chart wise, I finally got my opportunity to try to be the guy. And if this season didn't work out or whatever, it is what it is, and that's just destiny right there. But I had faith that we'll play football one way or another. It matters too much to too many people.
Who's the biggest freak on the defensive line right now?
Oh my gosh! I mean, I'm 21 years old. I work out more than the normal individual, but I just feel so inferior to a lot of those guys. just straight man wise. Biggest. I mean, DeMonte Capehart is one of the biggest guys I've ever seen. Almost Dexter big. Miles Murphy, I think, is just going to be unbelievable. Brian Breezy is just a man child. So a lot of those guys are just it's fun to watch. It makes you come out from your specialist cave during practice just to come just witness.
There were a lot of periods from 2015 to 18 when it just was unfair with the defensive line, where they were just creating a new line of scrimmage every play, and it feels like they're getting back to that.
Yeah, definitely. And what made those guys so special, I mean, when I first got here, Clee, Austin, Dex, and Christian, what was so fun was that, you see them covered on ESPN, you see their highlights, but you just saw how that it was lunch pail mentality 7 days a week. And I mean, there's no way I've never witnessed any group of individuals work harder in my life, and just prepare. And minus the fact that they were physical freaks, but they really, they prepared better than anybody in the country. And, obviously we got the intangibles in this new group, and then this, specifically D-line. But I think there's a culture already established that they can just buy right into to become like that. So it should be exciting.
Do you sneak any peeks at the freshman quarterback, Mr. DJ?
Yeah, I have. I've talked to the receivers. I mean, I roomed with Will Brown, a receiver, and he comes home with, he jokes about coming home with blisters on his hands from catching his ball. But he'll be, he's obviously looks the part, and he's going to do a great job as time goes on. And obviously he's got a pretty decent quarterback to look up to, especially this year.
Jack Maddox, scholarship deep snapper, less than 2 weeks away. Cannot wait to watch you guys hit the football field officially.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're in the Eastern Midlands and PD area and you're in any way interested in buying and selling a home, commercial property, land, need to consider reaching out to Uptown Realty. They're based out of Sumter and run by a friend of mine, Patrick Enzer, big Clemson guy, used to cover the Tigers in a newspaper capacity, longtime supporter of Tiger Illustrated, longtime listener to the Dubcast. The home buying process should be an enjoyable experience, so let Patrick and his staff do all the heavy lifting. All you got to do is pick up the phone and call 803-774-0435 or go to uptownrealtysc.com. If you're a business owner and your business involves credit card processing, you need to reach out to Tandem Innovative Payment Solutions. A lot of different ways that Tandem can improve your bottom line by shaving off some of those expenses. In addition to processing credit card payments, Tandem also manages inventory, schedules staff, tracks sales, gains insight into customers, and gets transaction reports. With Tandem, you're not a number, you're a neighbor. Learn more about Tandem at tandempayment.com. Harris Flooring has been a major part of the facilities enhancements over at Clemson, not just with athletics, but also at the university level. And we are thrilled that they are a part of the Dubcast as a sponsor. Since 1947, the Junkins family and Harris Flooring have provided a unique shopping experience through value in their services, developing the right product solutions, and delivering on their promises. To check out some reviews on their work, just go to their Facebook page, Harris Flooring America. Rave reviews, just first class all the way. Phone number 864-642-6183. All right, joined by Vernon Burton, the distinguished professor of history at Clemson University. How you doing, sir?
Fine, thank you. And you?
Doing well. I just sort of I don't want to say cold emailed you a few days ago. I had gone down a bit of a rabbit hole, learning more about Harvey Gantt and the integration of Clemson University, and stumbled on, I think it was Carolina Stories, which ETV had done, and saw some of your remarks on there. And one of the things that stuck out to me, and one of the reasons that I reached out to you, was you saying there's a lot of South Carolina's civil rights history, and including the history of Harvey Gantt's acceptance to Clemson, is kind of unknown or forgotten, or maybe some of both. And so that's the purpose of this interview. I guess is just first of all, what is in your mind the most sort of forgotten aspect of that era, that time, and what ultimately led to Clemson admitting Harvey Gantt in January of '63?
That's a great question, and let me frame it a little bit, because it is the integration of Clemson, and later what became known as integration with dignity, that reframed the narrative for South Carolina. And somehow, and I don't mean this to sound critical, because I'm not sure it was deliberate, but somehow with that successful and relatively peaceful, in the sense of no violence, at least, integration, and not a big to-do about it, and the support of Governor Hollings, it changed the way the perception of South Carolina had been. Unfortunately, what it made us think is that we in South Carolina are not like those rednecks down in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. We had integration with dignity and a successful civil rights movement. The great irony is, before that, if you look at the literature, what people said, South Carolina was a leader against integration, and perhaps the most successful state. Remember, South Carolina is really the last state to integrate, and they did it primarily by fighting it in the courts. But there is probably the most important 19th century writer, Walter Hines Page, once wrote that he would rather be an imp in Hades than a black person in South Carolina. And that was a reputation South Carolina had. It was signified perhaps as much by Governor Tillman and later Senator Tillman, who would make really outrageous statements about race and openly admitted that he participated with other major South Carolinians and many white South Carolinians in not only threatening intimidation, but actual murder of African Americans who were simply seeking their rights under the Constitution to vote. So I'm not sure if I'm being clear here, but I think this is one of the most important moments in the civil rights movement, that is Clemson's peaceful integration versus what had happened, even though it was primarily symbolic. For instance, when George Wallace stood in the courthouse door and said, he opposed not the courthouse door, at the University of Alabama, then he stepped out of the way and then went ahead and integrated. But he made a big deal of it, whereas Governor Hollings and particularly some of the industrialists and others who wanted to get industry in South Carolina understood that integration needed to come, and they ultimately supported it. But that was a huge change when you go back to it. A lot of people don't realize, and Larry, you need to stop me when you ask a historian. It's very easy to go on a 50-minute lecture for something you don't need to know.
No, those are great for podcasts.
You sure? So edit
Yes.
it out, please. I'm sorry about this, but it's like one thing leads to another.
Sure.
So, for example, we think of Brown v. Board. Well, Brown v. Board begins in South Carolina. The case that is the central case that becomes part of the five, and the first one was out of Clarendon, South Carolina, where Reverend Joe Delane organized a group of extraordinary, courageous people who lost everything. They've never been recognized, like the people who were the plaintiffs in Brown, but so different. In Kansas, the case we think about integration, right? When people think about it, only the schools from the first through the sixth grade were segregated, and the high schools weren't. Every person who signed that petition was a woman, a wife of someone, but their husbands didn't sign, and the only male was Reverend Brown in Kansas. Here, almost the whole community signed what became Briggs v. Elliott, and they suffered. I mean, they literally lost almost everything, and it began as just to have a school bus, and they got their own school bus, and they wanted gas, and by not giving that, it led into what became the 1954 decision on integration. But look, when you begin to have integration, it is 1963 for Harvey Gantt, and that's the first in the state in a public school. And then I graduated from 96 high school in 1965, and we were not integrated. It really doesn't come until Richard Nixon and some of the other things about federal funding that integration begins. But we don't see that story in South Carolina. To go back to Reverend Delane, he was threatened, and they moved him to save his life. The Methodist Episcopal Church, the African American Church, moved him to a different place in Lake City. And in Lake City, I'm trying to think of the time period. It may have been the 1890s. It could have been 1880. I know that Theodore Roosevelt was probably president. Tillman was prominent at the time, Governor Tillman. And you still had an active Republican Party, even though most African Americans couldn't vote because the federal government was Republican. There was a lot of appointments, and the postmaster was a black postmaster. They burned his house, and they killed him and his infant daughter in his hands as he came out of the a violent mob did. And Governor Tillman sort of congratulated them for what they had done, but you shouldn't have a black person in charge of the mail. And so when Delane goes there, that he gets a note saying, you know what we did to the postmaster, we're going to do the same to you. So he reported it to the police, and the police said, well, be sure and mark, if anybody comes by. So when they came by his house and started shooting it up, he shot back to mark the car. And, of course, they put a warrant out for him for attempted murder, and he had to sneak out of this state in the trunk of a car to finally get to New York for safety. And when he died, there was still a warrant for his arrest. And this is the man that really is most responsible for bringing about integration in the United States. That is integration after Reconstruction, because it was integrated before, during the Reconstruction period that we forget about. And he was such a South Carolinian, he moved back to Charlotte to get as close as he could to his native state, but couldn't come in the state. And that's a history we need to understand. These are true heroes. And, it's interesting because people learn their history not from the books that historians write, or my grandchildren will have a much larger educational fund than they do. But they learn their history from those buildings that we name and give them historic names, from those markers that we put historical markers, and no place more than the State House grounds. To give you an example, when I was a boy growing up in 96, we had a historical marker, and it was to Preston Brooks, who's from 96. His plantation was near here out in the country. And he is the congressman who caned and nearly killed Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor. Became one of the sort of events that historians look to leading to what becomes the Civil War. And, the country really divided on it, like our country so divided red and blue now. That was a big event. Many white Southerners cheered him. And, of course, in the North, it was shown to say, look what the violence in slavery leads to, this kind of violence in the very Senate chamber. Well, what is the message that we get to see this historical marker celebrating Preston Brooks? It meant that for at least us white children who went by that marker every day, that if you are going to be or want to be celebrated by your community, you beat the fire to people. So we won the state championship in football when I played, and I'm convinced we weren't as big and we weren't as fast, but we had that cultural sort of impetus that we had seen through these sort of examples. And that's a little bit maybe exaggerated, but I think there's a lot of truth to it, because history is learned, and the models that we give people are those kind of historical markers, and particularly statues of individuals. That's why I am so happy that we are celebrating Harvey Gantt. I don't think you could find a more better role model. And my argument would be, as a historian, I think these monuments are important. And I think we have to understand them mean different things to different people. And part of my generation of historians sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater when we made the arguments that someone like Thomas Jefferson was a, quote, you sort of just throw him out because you discover that he had black children with an underage African-American enslaved young woman. And we forget that he also wrote those beautiful words that inspired generations, and still do other countries too, about equality for all people. So I have changed my mind from the days I went to graduate school at Princeton and sort of began to study history, that while we have to be careful about heroes and understand that when we put particularly politicians and others as heroes, that they're ambivalent. They're like us. They're all people. They're complex. And you have to look at the whole arc of their lives to determine there's some things that we can admire. There are other things that we have to judge and say, well, that was wrong, and they were not good about that. But what I've determined is that it is important to have role models, if not heroes. And that's something that we can do in South Carolina. There's no better role model than Harvey Gantt, who is as close to anything I've ever seen to a Christian gentleman. Even though he had some rough times at Clemson, I have never heard Harvey say anything that was negative about Clemson. And it's been embarrassing. I've been on radio shows with him, and I have to say, well, did you have any trouble, Harvey? Oh, Clemson's wonderful. I have to say, well, Harvey, remember when they held up a noose?
Yeah.
You know, those kind of things. But I think that's it. And Harvey Gantt once said, one of my favorite sayings, he says, you may not be able to appeal to the morals of a South Carolinian, but you can appeal to his manners. Mm-hmm. And so I've often used that and say, now, you have the right to believe what you want to. I would never tell you how to think, how to vote, or anything like that, but let's try to be aware of what it means to other people. And once you understand that, do you still want to do these things or wave a flag or to say things? That's up to you. You have to, but at least let's know our true history. Let's know what it is. So, I would advocate that people like Reverend Delane, like the great Dr. Benjamin Mays. I'm so proud of this community of Greenwood, South Carolina. There is one statue of an individual in the county, and that is the great educator and theologian, Dr. Benjamin Mays, the longtime president of Morehouse College, who grew up here, whose first memory was of the Phoenix riot, where his own father was humiliated, could have been killed, where just African Americans were killed for trying to vote after the 1895 Constitutional Convention that disfranchised them. And he was a great apostle of peace. He understood the humanity of his oppressors. And if one can do that, I think what a role model. And there's a picture of him at now the Mays historical site. There's a statue, and he's sitting there with his Bible in his hand. Now, that's a great role model, I think. And I think we need role models like that, not just John C. Calhoun, who was an extraordinarily capable and talented statesman who was twice vice president, secretary, very, very important figure in American history, but so was Reverend Delane. So why not a statue of Reverend Delane on the State House ground as well? Now, I'm running off in a lot of tangents. I know you got questions, but I can go on like this forever. But that's sort of a background of where I come from on trying to understand and the importance of understanding. We need the truth, and then people can decide. That's been one of the issues. Historians have been complicit in painting a false narrative of what our history has been. And it's ironic that the Integration with Dignity changed. So I should let you ask some specific questions. I can go on and on. You probably don't want the history lessons, and you can read about it. But
so Harvey Gantt grows up in Charleston and has the desire to study architecture. Ends up going to Iowa State because of a program in the state of South Carolina that allows for the state to fund the difference in out-of-state tuition versus in-state for African Americans who aren't able to go to the state schools and study what they want to study. So he actually goes to Iowa State for a year. Am I getting all that right?
Yes, but he always wanted to be in, but it's more than that. And a lot of people miss this. Harvey was also very active in protest for integration in Charleston and city as a youth. And that's where he met Matthew Perry, the NAACP lawyer. So he was active even as a youth. Charleston had a very active NAACP. And so he had this protest in mind all along, that he was trying to bring about integration. And when people say, isn't this nice that the state would have this program? Think about this. Does it cost more to travel out to Iowa than it does to drive to Clemson? I mean, there were a lot of hidden costs. It was very hard. I mean, so this was a legal issue that went back to Plessy v. Ferguson that said separate but equal. So, this is South Carolina's way of saying, well, we will equalize it and pay the difference in the tuition for a student to go to another state where they can get the program. So that's one of the things that South Carolina, I think, why we were the last state to really integrate, is they really knew how to use the legal system. And a lot of that was because of James F. Burns, who had been a member of the Supreme Court and then comes back to South Carolina and, primarily to be governor to stop integration and to continue to support white supremacy. And he was very, very smart and one of the most able of all politicians. I've often said, when you think about Calhoun, James F. Burns, maybe Tillman, but certainly Strom Thurmond, they could have had, I believe, memorials to them in Washington, D.C., if they had used those talents in other ways, as opposed to be so committed to what we called our way of life, which was white supremacy and white privilege, because they were so smart and were able to do, a lot of good things for a lot of people. But they also supported and supported it very successfully, white supremacy and segregation, for as long as it, until really the 1964 Civil Rights Act and then the 1965 Voting Rights Act. I've often said that two things changed the American South that I grew up in. One was air conditioning. I don't think you would have in Greenville, or certainly Bowen in Charleston, or in Greenville, some of Michelin Tire, or some of these other international companies without air conditioning. But you also wouldn't have had them without the Voting Rights Act. And it's ironic that because of the education and our emphasis on STEM and on science and math, that we understand better how air conditioning works than we understand how the Voting Rights Act works. Mm-hmm. Which is to just ensure that people, no matter what their color or background, or what, have a right to participate in a democratic society, to vote.
And you mentioned Governor Burns, how, I guess, smart and calculating he was in the massive resistance to integration. I guess in his words, they came up with a policy, or I guess a law, I guess, if any African-American person were to register himself or herself under court order at Clemson, Winthrop, the University of South Carolina, or any of the other white schools in the state, that school was immediately to close its doors. And then also South Carolina State in Orangeburg was also to close its doors, which was at that time was the place for the African Americans to go to school.
Right, and of course, a lot less funded, a lot less opportunities. Here's one of the great ironies of that, though, when they had to create, one of the lawsuits they didn't have a law school blacks could go to, so they created the one at South Carolina State, and out of this segregated law school, though, came, Judge Perry and all of these extraordinary attorneys like Boulware, who then got the laws changed. Even though it was integrated. But, to graduate from South Carolina State was not the same thing as to graduate from Clemson, even though they were both land-grant schools. Clemson got the lion's share of all the money and the grants. And that's something that's often left out, too, about Harvey Gantt, that why Clemson did integrate, that Clemson would no longer get some of these federal grants for science research, for agricultural research, if it continued to be segregated. So that's sort of a behind-the-scenes story of partly why Clemson wanted to integrate. And of course, without that, you wouldn't have all the industry and other things that came as well into South Carolina. It seems so silly now when you think about it, but people really believe that the world would collapse if you had integration. I mean, it's hard to believe today, but people felt that strongly. It's one of the things that bothers me the most about today. I do not want to justify Tillman. Do not misunderstand this, okay? But Ben Tillman believed this nonsense. And historians were complicit, scientists were complicit. They were all saying these things about black inferiority, that sort of thing. The failure of Reconstruction, which was just the opposite. It was the most progressive period and the most progressive constitution South Carolina's ever had. But, you know, what matters is what people believe, not the actuality. And we created this myth and people bought into it. It's one of the few times where the people who lost a war really wrote the history and wrote the memory of it, and created this false image of the Civil War that goes back even that all white supported it. You know, every single, I'm getting off track with you, but it all relates. Every single Confederate state had a regiment that fought for the Union, except for South Carolina. And it had a lot of people who did. I'm not just talking about if you figure out how many blacks fought for the Union. The first black troops came right out of down around Beaufort and, you know, Port Royal and all that area. But the number of whites, James Henry Hammond, the senator from South Carolina, former governor, who said his brother was a surgeon in the Union Army. So many people from South Carolina went off and joined the North Carolina regiments to fight for this. You know, this was the home of Andrew Jackson, too, the Unionist. A lot of strong Unionists. We sort of wrote those out of our history. And a lot more were drafted who, you know, went in. It wasn't this thing. I face this all the time with people, but the images, everybody was united, rushed off to fight this war for states' rights. But if you look and see what people said at the time, what the actual ordinance of secession, it says to preserve slavery. So it's again, what people believe is what matters more than what really happened. I think it's critical upon us to at least get the story straight, and then people can make their decisions, at least knowing their history and the background of which they're making it.
So do you recall when Harvey Gantt first applied to Clemson? Was that when he was at Iowa State, or was it when he was in high school?
Oh, boy, I cannot remember. I believe it was Iowa State, but I can't remember. I know he wanted to go to Clemson all along, you know, architecture, but could not. And he applied several times at Clemson, you know. Yeah, and then... it's in the article I wrote, Larry. We can look it up.
It's okay. Yeah, you're referring to an essay you wrote called Dining with Harvey Gantt, Myths and Realities of Integration with Dignity. That was in the book, Matthew Perry, The Man, His Times, and His Legacy. The part that is interesting is how much Clemson fought it at the time. I think he several.
And even afterwards, a lot of people don't realize that even afterwards they were trying to find ways legally, you know, to get him out.
And so it went to the Court of Appeals, I guess, in Virginia, and then thrown back to Anderson, and then back, I guess, to the Supreme Court. What was the basis for Clemson's argument at the time that he should not be admitted, or that African Americans should not be admitted?
Well, the laws of South Carolina were segregation, of course. So
just to be clear,
separate but equal was supposedly, even though they never overrode Plessy, even though they had Brown v. Board, it became, and all these court cases had to come about to, sort of say, no, you cannot, there's no such thing as separate but equal. That came out of the Clarendon County case. The first federal judge to ever rule that separate but equal is not fair was, in fact, Judge Waddy's Waring in Charleston, in the case that goes on to be Brown v. Board that we talked about earlier.
And so, as you mentioned earlier, very violent episodes in Georgia and Alabama.
Mississippi.
Mississippi.
Mississippi in particular, where you have riots, people killed, and a reporter killed.
And so basically there's motivation in South Carolina that arises that, hey, we're not going to do that here. This is inevitable. This is going to happen sooner rather than later. So we might as well go ahead and not create an embarrassing situation. So there was a lot of motivation on R.C. Edwards' part, on the government of South Carolina's part to make this as smooth as possible.
Yeah, and particularly from some of the leading industrialists, and manufacturers and others, because you still had a strong group who wanted to oppose it.
Happy to have Founders Federal Credit Union on board as a sponsor with us. If you've been to a sporting event in Clemson, you've probably heard about Founders already. They are the official credit union partner of the Clemson Tigers. In addition to that, all Clemson faculty, staff, and students are eligible for membership as well as IPTAY members. Matt Gross is a proud Clemson alum and the vice president for the Clemson market for Founders Federal Credit Union. Matt's office is located beside the Walmart Neighborhood Market on Old Greenville Highway in Clemson. For more information, go to foundersfcu.com. Another loyal supporter of the Dubcast is Blackacre Law Firm in Greenville, a subsidiary of Parham Smith and Archambault. Blackacre helps South Carolina residents achieve their dreams of home ownership by providing experienced professional representation for real estate closings. Attention to detail is crucial in real estate law. Blackacre is committed to making sure nothing gets by them preparing residential or commercial closings. Blackacre also offers estate planning services for their clients in the Greenville area. Find out more about Blackacre at 864-326-3507. And so then he's, as you mentioned, his entire first semester at Clemson, when he's actually here, Clemson is still fighting it in the courts.
Yeah, trying to find ways, yes. But I actually think that they had pretty well resigned themselves to it. And I think Clemson needs to be congratulated that they made it work, So it's always complicated.
Yeah.
And academic leaders are always having to make tough decisions, as our academic leaders are right now with this pandemic, let alone the calls for renaming of buildings and what we recognize and don't recognize. How do you tread those grounds? You have particularly alumni upset on both sides, supporters upset on both sides. So it was a tough situation, and at least South Carolina got through it without the kind of horrible violence. And as I said, it changed South Carolina's reputation.
And there were actually like
Harvey helped do that. You see, I've argued the people with the dignity were Harvey Gantt and Matthew Perry, if you want to talk about integration with dignity. And I think I outlined that pretty well in the article that I wrote, just what they, went through with. And as you remember, the dining with Harvey is the sort of takeoff on, even when they had to have meals and things, segregation. So when Harvey comes through, and of course Clemson was integrated. All the dining hall workers, the cooks, were all black. So when Harvey came through, people wanted to eat with him because they got the best food from the cooks.
And that's the most touching image, is when you have this man in a foreign land. Nobody looks like him, and obviously he's going through a really controversial situation. When a lot of people would have been scared. He says he wasn't, but when he first walks into the lunchroom and he sees all these people who look like him, and he sees the pride that they had in the fact that now their kids, whether born or unborn, were going to have an opportunity to make a better life for themselves and their families, and how touching that was to him.
Yeah. And, Joel Collins, who's an attorney and was at Clemson at that time, he says to me that Dean Cox asked him and some others to make sure that nothing bad happened to Harvey. So the deans and others were, as opposed to other states, just throwing the people in. Like one of the people who went to Georgia didn't stay, went to Alabama, same thing, to make sure there was no problems. And, you can't stop people's hostile stares or things that they do, but you can make sure someone's safe. And so the dean had reached out to Joel Collins and others to let's make this happen and do it. So that touched me deeply. But, there was a minister at the Baptist church there who worked with Harvey trying to get him in. Like they would say, your transcript doesn't have this, or I can't remember all the details. We're missing this in your application, so you're denied. And so this Baptist minister, when the Baptist Student Association there, I think he worked with the Baptist students. So again, it's in the article. It's been a while I read it, met with Harvey to help him and all of this and to do it and to get the application right. And he was literally fired or driven out of town. But you've got to realize these are some heroes. These are some stories we need to know, just like the African Americans down in Clarendon County, those whites who were on the right side of history, those whites who went against the grain. And there have been a lot of them in South Carolina that their stories are not known. During Reconstruction, there were so many whites who literally, risked their life. Many of them were killed, in fact. I just read in the paper the other day about a white legislator from Abbeville who was, helping teach blacks to read and write and things, and he's killed and thrown in a creek with his black, who had been his former slave, but now servant that he was working for him. And there's so many stories like that. Think about the courage. There has been violence. We remember in our own time the story at Lamar with the school bus being turned over during the 1970 campaign. I'd just gone to Princeton, was in shock because I had, been proud of South Carolina trying to work toward this thing and seeing the violence that came out. Of course, busing is an issue that is not just a Southern issue. It may be worse in other areas. Since all of us wanted to ride the bus when we were growing up, as opposed to what busing became to symbolize later. But we've had those instances. Another great example is the Civil Rights Act is in 1964. The Orangeburg Massacre is 1968, protesting to go into a bowling alley. At Orangeburg. And these kids are shot. 3 die, 27, 28 wounded. Most of them shot in the back, the buckshot in the heels of their feet as they're running away. I mean, we have a history that we need to deal with. I think to understand how, if we're going to have a dialogue and do something about this, we need to understand how other people feel. How would we have felt if our children, white children, had been shot because they wanted to go into a bowling alley by, in fact, state troops. And we've never really sort of reconciled with this. I taught at Coastal, at College of Charleston, and at Clemson, and hardly ever have I had a student who's even heard of the Orangeburg Massacre. Somehow it's left out of our history book. And we don't want to talk about lynching and to make people feel terrible or upset, but I think we need to understand that violence has been there, and we've had these incidents that we're so reckoning with today, of particularly official violence, state officers or local officers having used violence. I mean, the most famous case is probably now that people know about. I think I wrote about it one of the first times in the article I did called The Black Squint of the Law years ago, is the blinding of Isaac Woodard, which may have been at least part of it, according to Judge Waring, who is the person who ruled in the Clarendon case as a federal judge, that separate but equal is not right. He had that court case where, the sheriff had blinded Isaac Woodward, a veteran in his uniform, just because he had wanted to go to the bathroom and had something exchanged, and he blinded him both eyes with his billy club, and the jury, all-white jury, immediately dismissed it. And apparently that really triggered something in Judge Waring about the unfairness of the laws. And you don't want to dwell on these horrible things, but to think they haven't happened, we can't understand how one group of our citizens feel. I was once debating the Sons of the Confederacy right after the Ken Burns film on South Carolina Educational Television. And this is just to give you an example of how I try to get students to think a little differently, Larry. And I remember one of them was Bradford, was it Bradford Reynolds? I'm trying to think. William Bradford, maybe. I'm forgetting the name now, but he'd been nominated for National Endowment for the Humanities chair, and even George Will had thought he was too conservative, but he turned out we got to be friends after this debate, even though it got heated. But they kept going. There were two of them, and I was between them. They couldn't get anybody else to do it, and they were going to boycott South Carolina television if no one would debate them. After Ken Burns said he wouldn't. So I agreed, flew down from Illinois. And I mean, it was a heated exchange. Everybody in there, except for three people, were, with the Sons of the Confederacy. And they kept going on and on about how South Carolina had lost the Civil War and how horrible and what it had done to South Carolina. It was the most tragic period. And so I said, I don't understand why you say South Carolina lost the Civil War. South Carolina didn't lose a Civil War. You could hear a pin drop. And then I tried to explain. And I said, you can say the Confederate state of South Carolina lost, but the majority, the great majority of the people in South Carolina were, in fact, enslaved and African Americans, and they wanted the Union to win. So you can't say the people of South Carolina lost. And that's part of the way we need to look at our history. Until the 1930 census, South Carolina had been a majority black state, and that is why there is a letter to the editor, I believe, of the Post. It's in a collection of manuscripts at Duke that I read, where James Byrne, as a congressman, writes to the editor of the state, maybe it's to the state paper. I can look it up. I've got it somewhere. At any rate, that he says, it's a shame, but we have to look at every law we pass because African Americans are majority in the state, and if they had the vote or legal rights, then they would be in charge. So that sort of framed the way people made laws, is what he was saying. And that's something I think we need to understand, how the institutions, the laws, were focused of what I called the black squint of the law, from the Wallace, who was the great historian up until Walter Edgar was sort of the Mr. South Carolina historian. Until Walter's book, he had the main primary book, and he had been at the 1895 convention and talked about how the laws had a black squint to them when they formed the Constitution. And it's something I've dealt with my friend Armand Durfner, who we've just finished this book manuscript on race in the Supreme Court. And it's just amazing because I didn't know this. I've studied my whole life, just how much of our laws have been framed in a way to disadvantage black people, not just through slavery, but, up into the 1970s and 80s with redlining, with loans, all of these sorts of things. So it's a complex story. And, I think South Carolina has good reason to be proud that we integrated Clemson and pretty much the schools without the problems of other states. But we shouldn't forget the other part of that we fought it and we were the last. What would have happened if we had been forced to integrate earlier, I wonder, would we have been like Mississippi? At least South Carolinians learn from the mistakes of others.
As you're trying to, as a historian, as you're trying to evaluate the legacy of important historical figures, how hard is it to square, on one hand, this person was merely a product of his time, and then on the other, this guy did bad things? Like, how difficult is that to arrive at I guess a simple conclusion?
It's not easy. And here's what makes it perhaps is, in every period, there were others who were whites who did stand for, either out of religious motivation, say like a Henry Brisbane, who had been a pro-slavery writer down in the Beaufort area, who, as he was writing as a minister defending slavery, was arguing with the abolitionists, got convinced the other way, and so he freed all his slaves. Well, he didn't. He actually sold them, went north. He took all the money he had and tried to find them all and freed them all, bought them and freed them. And then couldn't find one. And it's ironic, when he was reading the Emancipation Proclamation, when he was back in Beaufort as a tax collector appointed by Lincoln as a tax commissioner, there in the crowd was the one that he had not been able to free, who was in a Union uniform, had freed himself. And then he is one of the reasons that African Americans on Hilton Head have their land, because as a tax commissioner, he made decisions that allowed African Americans to keep that land where in other places they were not able to. So, you have people all along. You have the Tauberts here in 96, South Carolina, who continue to support black rights. That was the cause of the Phoenix riot, were the Tauberts, who were encouraging African Americans to vote. You have people like Laura Towns, who was not from South Carolina, but who spent the rest of her life here teaching down at Penn Center to help African Americans with education, understand how important education was. So you have whites and blacks who did the right things. You had an incredible group during the civil rights movement who were here in this state who were supporting black rights, young and older people. So it's a much more complex story, and it makes it a little harder because there are people who are arguing for what we think of as right today, when others are, saying just the opposite. So it gets very complex. I do say that I have less sympathy for some of the arguments of people today, because they do know better than from people at the time. But I think you do have to evaluate people in their context. And you can understand that someone like Tillman, I think, actually did one of the more progressive governors in terms of trying to bring what we think of as a progressive form of government to South Carolina. More representation for whites in the upcountry, Winthrop and Clemson. But you also cannot deny and look past that he was one of the most notorious, that became a symbol and reveled in it, of white supremacy. But he was, people don't realize that he was a serious candidate for vice president, because he had this era we call the progressive era. He had come up with a solution which, for what we think of as prohibition, which was the state regulation of liquor to try to get rid of moonshining and other things. Was the state would just, bottle the liquor and get taxes from it. The other thing is, a lot of people don't realize when they condemn Tillman, the law that Citizens United, Supreme Court case, overturned was the Tillman Act to keep big money out of politics, to regulate corporations and things. So, it's a more complex legacy than people think. Calhoun's even more so, or Woodrow Wilson, because Calhoun, when young John Kennedy as a senator wanted to erect 5 statues of the most important senators the U.S. ever had, he wrote to my favorite historian, C. Van Woodward, the Yale historian, or Hopkins and then Yale, who wrote Origins of the New South, Tom Watson, the Grand Rebels, and then the strange career of Jim Crow, probably the greatest historian of the last couple of generations. That's a value judgment. But he listed the 5, and among them was Calhoun because of his original contribution to constitutional and law. And today, when you have, these horrible situations of countries going to war, slaughtering each other, people are looking back to Calhoun's ideas on what they now call political divorce. We would maybe say secession or the right to nullify. So you see the complexity. At the same time, he introduces a slavery is a positive good argument in the Senate in 1837. And that changes the whole dynamic. So the people like Abraham Lincoln, who all thought slavery is so complicated and so complex, we can't do anything about it. It's a necessary evil. We have to live with it. To Calhoun says it is a positive good and the best of all. And that sort of made it where you couldn't ignore. You had to take sides on it. And you can see how that would upset people today as well. But I think we shouldn't forget how important he was in one of the most divided eras in American history, like today. When he was appointed Secretary of War, it was unanimous. It was unheard of in the Tyler administration. So that just gives you an idea. You don't want to deny that he was an important player. Woodrow Wilson, who has, South Carolina roots as well, from Columbia. Yes, he segregated the federal government, showed Birth of a Nation in the White House, but he was trying to find a way to bring peace. And what we think of as United Nations today, he was determined to make democracy work, at least for other nations and white folks and all of this. So you have to look at the arc of a person's life. And I think, we're not dumb. We can figure out that there are bad and good in most folks. I know for my own self, there, but the grace of God go, I don't mean that in an egotistical manner either, but I think a little humility never hurts, to understand that life is complicated, relations are complicated, and we need to try to understand those, and maybe not dismiss the idea that Jefferson said all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator, just because he did things that are pretty horrific in his personal life. Ideas can transcend the individual, I think, and that can live on in a positive way. And I think it's important that we understand that. So I'm not giving you a very good answer, Emma Larry, but you're absolutely right. It is complex, and it's complex on both sides. It's very easy to say no. In South Carolina, maybe more than any other state, we have always been uncritical, particularly of our leaders, and particularly our governors. Tillman was really despised by a lot of people in the Low Country, and in many ways, that monument was put in Columbia just to, aggravate him because he was so divisive. And he, our present leader of the free nation is not the first person to use controversy and division to make himself popular and a leader. But if you read the books and things, you don't see anything very critical. We have just been more in South Carolina, maybe anywhere else, to be critical of leaders. And I think that's not good. We need to learn to be. It doesn't mean that you hate them or that you despise or you demean them, but to look at them. That's what history, that's what the liberal arts are about, learning to think critically and make evaluations and make judgments. But we have not done very well, particularly in the public schools, and even though we've done a lot better in the colleges. Well, actually, part of what's happening with this whole monument and renaming movement is that what historians have known since the 1960s has finally come down in generations to public school teachers, I think. And so we're getting a better accounting of our history, and people begin to think about these things. I think that's the way ideas work. It takes time. It takes time to change old myths and try to straighten out the complexities and the ambiguities. And, something I really enjoy, that is understanding who we are, how we got to where we are, and how we think as we do, and why. And is that the best way to do it, or are there alternatives that we might want to consider? And I do think we have to be respectful of other people's opinion on both sides of these issues and understand that symbols like the Confederate flag or Ben Tillman can legitimately mean different things to different groups of people. Heartfelt and not with malice in their hearts and things either.
Vernon Burton, the author of The Age of Lincoln and expert on the Harvey Gantt admission to Clemson. What a fascinating and graceful person Harvey Gantt was and is, and I've really enjoyed sort of digging deeper into that, and I encourage any Clemson person out there as well to learn more about it. It's hard to envision anybody not being totally engrossed by that chapter in Clemson's history.
And no one is a bigger, I think, supporter of Clemson than Harvey Gantt is. He is such a modest, humble man to have done so much in his life. And as I said, it's not just that going into Clemson was like Rosa Parks, the myth there. He had been an activist, opposed segregation, and for integration, even as a high school student. I'm not sure when exactly he first applied to Clemson, though it's in the article somewhere. It may have even been when he went to Iowa State.
Well, listen, really appreciate you sharing your time on short notice with somebody you don't even know. I really appreciate it.
Well, no, thank you. I think it's very important that we in the Academy reach out to the public. I really do. I don't know if you knew about the conference I did on Lincoln's unfinished work, but I did a workshop as well for school teachers on how to teach about race, the history of race, not about race, about the history of race in the schools, public schools. That's one of the hardest things in the world to do, and particularly with young students. How do you do this? And I really think that, those public school teachers are doing God's work. Never, probably as much as today, both sides, with also the COVID stress, all the issues that are floating around today, as we're really, at least we have been trying to deal with some of this history and some of the reconciliations about race that we have not dealt with very well in the past.
All right, thanks so much to Vernon Burton and Jack Maddox for joining us. Great stuff on both counts. Everybody have a wonderful weekend. Appreciate y'all listening. Appreciate our sponsors for their support. Please support them as much as you can, as well as all the local businesses around you that you know and love during this time. Everybody have a wonderful weekend. We'll be back next week. Cheers.